The sudden disappearance of Kathy Horn from Traverse City, Michigan was the beginning of a confusing and mysterious story. No one understood how something like that could happen here in the small, quiet town. The police had many theories at first. They thought the 16-year-old girl might have been fascinated by music and followed a group of nomads traveling with her favorite rock band. Then it became known that Kathy worshipped Satan and practiced black magic, and the officers suspected she might have been sacrificed. But what really happened to Kathy? Traverse City lies on the shore of Lake Michigan and attracts many tourists throughout the year. Here, you can enjoy all the colors of autumn. It is a very popular vacation destination, a great place to live and work for anyone who loves nature. In the fall, these places are particularly beautiful. At that time of year, many businesses offer tours to Traverse City, and even those with the most sophisticated tastes will find something they like. Traverse City is known as the world capital of food, and you can find everything your heart desires. The entertainment industry is also strong, offering music, culture, and all the advantages of a big city. It was to this ideal place that Janice moved in 1991 after marrying her husband, so she could start a new life in Traverse City with her daughter, Kathy Horn. She chose this city because it was quiet and very peaceful. In the fall of 1994, Kathy finally fell in love with her new home. Janice would wake up every day at 3 in the morning and head to her job at the nearest bakery to bake muffins. They lived in the tourist part of town, almost on the lake. Kathy loved it there. If the 16-year-old wasn't in school or at the beach, she spent her time with her school friends. Kathy enjoyed being around people and quickly made friends. They loved her and she loved them. Kathy also wanted to be successful in the future. She planned to go to university and make her love of the natural sciences her profession. She loved dolphins and wanted to become a marine biologist. She was just beginning to discover who she was as a person and had wonderful plans for the future, but she was not destined to fulfill those dreams. On September 26, 1994, around 3 p.m., Kathy's best friend, Jenzara, stopped by her house after school and asked her mother where Kathy was. Janice immediately became worried because Kathy was supposed to spend the weekend at Jen's place, go to school on Monday from there, and then come back home after school. Janice didn't understand what was going on. Jen then confessed she hadn't seen Kathy in the last 2 days. Jen told her that on Friday evening after school, she had driven Kathy to the neighboring town of Gaylord. They stopped in Mansalona and picked up 3 other friends of Kathy. In Gaylord, the friends went to a popular cafe that teenagers liked for its music and good atmosphere. Jen said that around 2:30 a.m., some of their acquaintances wanted to go home while she wanted to stay longer. This meant Kathy and the others had to find their own way back to Traverse City. Janice immediately asked with whom they left, and Jen said they went with a man named David. The girl did not know his last name. She only knew that he worked part-time at various places in Gaylord, including that coffee shop. Janice feared the worst, probably like all parents would. Without wasting a minute, she rushed to the Traverse City police station in a panic with Jen to file a missing persons report. Every year, the police receive hundreds of similar reports, and just because a teenager hasn't checked in for a while doesn't mean something terrible has happened. But Janice was sure her daughter would never run away from home. While the mother was filing the report, Jen told the police officers who Kathy had been with that Saturday night, David and 3 other friends, Tyler, Carrie, and Jim. But the girl had no valuable information about them. She didn't even know their last names. Traverse City is a small town with a low crime rate, so there were only 2 investigators. One of them was Dan Hill, who was tasked with finding the people who had been with Kathy before she disappeared. According to him, there is always a problem when dealing with teenagers. They don't really know names or addresses and have no idea about one another's acquaintances. Since every minute counted, Kathy's details were immediately entered into the missing persons database, and a hotline was set up to gather information. Investigator Hill checked all of the girl's bank records and found some alarming information. She had not withdrawn even a single cent from her savings account. If someone is on the run, they typically take all their money with them and don't leave it in the bank. It began to look like something really had happened to her. The police issued a missing person announcement and asked the public for any information about the girl's whereabouts. It was published in newspapers, broadcast on the radio, and shown on TV. The information that came in varied widely. None of it was concrete. Some believed the girl ran off with her new boyfriend. Others thought she simply didn't want to go to school. Some even reported seeing her in a parking lot in Vanderbilt, 120 km from the city. It was simply impossible to make sense of it all. Investigator Hill decided to turn the case over to the Michigan State Police because they had more resources to conduct the investigation. The case was assigned to Kevin Day, an investigator with 15 years of experience. In 95% of missing persons cases, they run away voluntarily or leave with someone. But the fact that the girl was only 16 and had not returned to her mother alarmed the officers. While other investigators searched for David from the coffee shop, Investigator Day interviewed Kathy's mother and tried to find out who else was close to her daughter. Janice said Kathy had been in a relationship for 6 months with a 20-year-old named Eric Keston, and they had recently broken up. According to the mother, the girl took this relationship very seriously. Kathy was young and had unconsciously fallen in love. He was too old, and Janice disapproved of their relationship. But it wasn't just his age that bothered her. The main issue was that he was involved in the occult. Eric and Kathy were somehow involved in what people called black magic, which set off alarm bells for the investigators. The police contacted Eric and asked him to come to the station for questioning, which he immediately agreed to do. In most of these crimes, it's usually committed by the person closest to the victim, often a husband or lover, so Eric was the first suspect. However, he had nothing to hide and was worried about Kathy's disappearance. The officers asked him why he and Kathy had broken up. Eric explained they had simply drifted apart. Then they asked where he was on the day Kathy disappeared. He said he had gone with friends to Grand Rapids for the weekend and provided names of people who could confirm this. The investigators also wanted to know about his involvement with the occult. Eric said he was a magician, as was Kathy. He then described the initiation ceremony they performed around a large bonfire. He claimed they wore long robes and chanted. Eric also spoke about the Book of Shadows, human sacrifices, and autumn equinoxes. He explained that if a ritual gave power to the cult members, it was entirely justified. He also revealed that a certain Tim Coppett had set fire to the wine, and everyone then drank from the sacred chalice. He said the officers definitely needed to talk to Tim, because he knew that Kathy was being prepared for something big. Tim was the leader of this so-called sect. Could black magic and human sacrifice have been the cause of Kathy's disappearance? The small town of Traverse City, Michigan, was slowly gripped by panic. All the residents suffered under the uncertainty that surrounded them. Usually, it's in big cities that girls go missing, and it felt impossible that something like this could happen here. But terrible things can happen anywhere, anytime, to anyone. The police questioned Kathy's ex-boyfriend, Eric Keston, and established that he had been 3 hours away from her at the time of her disappearance. They no longer suspected him, but they weren't as sure about Tim Coppett. Eric insisted that Tim was in charge of the gatherings for the sect both he and Kathy belonged to. Perhaps Tim knew what happened to Kathy. The investigators searched there for clues, as many pieces of information pointed in that direction. But first, they had to clear the people who had been with Kathy in her last hours before she disappeared. The police had suspects: David and the others who had been with Kathy that night. They focused on locating them. While the police in Gaylord questioned people at the cafe, Michigan State Police investigators went to Traverse City High School to talk to Kathy's friends. None of her friends had seen her since Friday, and no one knew where she might have gone. But the investigators discovered something important. One of the students knew David, who occasionally worked at that cafe, and said his last name was Chinky. He drove a green van and lived in Gaylord on Halfman Lake Road. After identifying David, the officers drove to that address. When they finally found him at a friend's house, the 30-year-old was very surprised to learn that Kathy was missing. He was willing to answer all of the police officers' questions and told them he had indeed seen Kathy and 3 other people that night. When asked, he said he barely knew Kathy and had only seen her a few times at the cafe. He added that around 1 a.m. on Saturday, he had offered to act as chauffeur because Kathy's friend Jen said she was with a man and didn't want to leave so early. She arranged for David to drive Kathy back to Traverse City, dropping off 3 other passengers she knew in Mansalona on the way. David then described the route they had taken and said that once they got to Mansalona and dropped the 3 people off, he was going to drive Kathy back to Traverse City. But on the way, she asked to get out. She said she wanted to continue on with them. He pulled over, let her out, and never saw her again. Then he simply drove back to Gaylord. Investigator Day had no reason at first to doubt David's words, but when he noticed cuts on his arm, he became suspicious. David claimed he had cut himself on the side mirror of his car. When the investigators asked permission to search the vehicle, he agreed. It was a large, outdated model, obviously not in the best condition. The officer was looking for anything else suspicious, especially wanting to verify that the mirror was indeed broken. It was, just as David had said. So it turned out he had apparently cut his hand accidentally. There was no sign of Kathy in the van. Investigator Day then asked David to reconstruct the path he had taken to pick up the teenagers. David described which roads they had traveled on with his passengers. The investigators then asked him to take a lie detector test, which he did. Before they left, the officers asked David directly if he knew what had happened to Kathy. His answer shocked them. David believed something occult was involved. He advised the investigators to talk to Tim and hinted they should look at all the sect members. David claimed Tim lived just 30 km south in Waters Township, Michigan. With this new information, Investigator Day left David and gave him a business card. The name Tim Coppett and his description as the leader of a sect had already come up in the case, and Day felt he had to meet the man. One thing was clear. It wasn't just Coppett's reputation that was eerie. Even the road leading to his house was unsettling. Off the highway, there was a star painted on the door, similar to a satanic symbol. As the investigators approached the front door, they wondered if they might be walking into a killer's hideout. Maybe Kathy had come here, and something terrible happened to her. When the door suddenly opened, the investigators saw something that shocked them deeply. 10 days had passed since the 16-year-old Kathy Horn had disappeared on September 24, 1994, near Traverse City, where she lived. The whole town rushed to help search for her, especially her terrified mother, Janice. The investigators hoped that Tim Coppett, the leader of the local satanic gatherings Kathy had allegedly attended, could answer all their questions. When the police officers arrived at Tim's house in the woods, they could hardly believe their eyes. Inside hung many long, colored satanic robes. They also saw a picture of a raven and some strange star diagrams. It was obvious to the investigators that these items were used for devilish rituals. Tim did not deny that he was the leader of the Hawthorne cult, whose followers worshiped the forces of nature. He claimed they worshipped the cosmos as a whole, and he insisted he had nothing to do with black magic or Satanism, which would include human sacrifices and all else connected to that. He was very evasive in answering questions, about what they actually did during their gatherings. The investigators found it suspicious that Tim's house was only about 10 miles from where Kathy had supposedly gotten out of David's car. Could he have been the one who kidnapped her for some magical ritual? Tim swore he had nothing to do with Kathy's disappearance and said he had last seen her 2 weeks earlier. Asked where he was on Saturday, September 24, he said he had spent the weekend at home. Tim then voluntarily took a lie detector test, which he passed. As a result, he was officially dropped from the list of suspects. The next day, the investigators received a tip that changed the direction of their search. The police in Mansalona had spoken to several people and learned the names of those who had been in the car with Kathy that Saturday night: Tyler Heath, Carrie Britt, and Jim Patterson. The police checked all three. Britt and Patterson were not considered suspicious, but Tyler's background surprised them. 3 years earlier, he had pleaded guilty to negligent homicide and spent 6 months in jail. At that time, Tyler was around 19 or 20 years old. He had no fixed occupation or place to work. The police wanted to question Tyler and went to his house in Mansalona. He admitted he had been in David's car that night with his girlfriend Carrie, Kathy, and Jim. He told the officers he had offered Kathy a place to stay overnight, but she absolutely wanted to go back to Traverse City. When asked why she insisted, he said she had told him she wanted to go to a Grateful Dead concert and needed to meet up with friends. Tyler said they watched the van drive down the road without stopping. Investigator Day was left wondering whether Kathy had gotten into trouble before she could catch up with her friends or whether Tyler might be lying. Day then asked him about the cult Kathy was involved in, but Tyler said he knew nothing about it. It seemed Tyler had nothing to hide. The police asked him to take a lie detector test, which he passed. Based on the personal interviews and test results, Investigator Day was convinced Tyler had nothing to do with Kathy's disappearance. Still, Tyler wasn't the only passenger that night. The next day, police questioned his girlfriend, Carrie. She told them a version of events they had already heard. She basically confirmed what Tyler had said. Carrie denied any involvement in the sect or Kathy's disappearance and also agreed to a lie detector test, which she passed. She was worried about Kathy's disappearance and shared everything she knew. Only one more passenger remained to be questioned: Jim Patterson. He told the investigators the same story. He was open during the interview and essentially repeated what Carrie and Tyler had said. However, Jim mentioned a small detail that completely changed the course of the investigation. He remembered Kathy saying she needed to be in Traverse City by 7 in the morning to meet members of the Rainbow Tribe. But who were the Rainbow Tribe? It turned out to be a group of Grateful Dead fans who traveled around the country following the band. Promiscuous sex and illegal substances were part of their lifestyle. This environment could be dangerous for a young girl. Kathy said they were going to a Grateful Dead concert on Saturday. If she really had joined up with the tribe, the investigators could track them to figure out her movements. They just had to find the tribe first. Jim gave the officers the names of some people Kathy intended to meet. The police realized it wouldn't be easy to find this group of free-spirited nomads, as they were constantly on the move. Still, they inquired about their whereabouts. Kathy had disappeared just before a concert by her favorite band, and Investigator Day had a bad feeling about it. The police had no doubt that something bad had happened to Kathy and were determined to find out exactly what it was. Day continued his investigation and spoke with several of Kathy's close friends, learning the names of more Rainbow Tribe members. Unfortunately, they all claimed the girl hadn't shown up that Saturday. The investigators concluded Kathy never made it to the Rainbow Tribe, though her family clung to the hope that she was still alive. Everyone began to fear the worst. After the police processed thousands of messages from the public, they received another tip that sounded almost like a confession. An anonymous call came in from someone claiming to be Sean Barth. The man said he had killed Kathy Horn. Since it was an anonymous call, the investigators had no details about the confession, so they went to the house of the alleged caller in Grayling, about 40 km south of Gaylord, where Kathy disappeared. However, during questioning, the 17-year-old Sean seemed just as confused as the investigators. They questioned him thoroughly, but he denied all accusations. Sean insisted he was innocent and claimed someone was simply trying to get revenge on him for a stolen snowmobile, though he refused to give the person's name. Because the call was anonymous, the police had no evidence to arrest him. After speaking with Sean, the investigators determined the claim was not credible. Frustrated, they realized the investigation was at a standstill. Kathy did not reappear, and no one knew where she was. Over the next year and a half, the local police and the Michigan State Police continued following leads and reports from various sightings, but the investigation went nowhere. Kathy had too many friends and acquaintances, and she also had a mother who was sure Kathy would have contacted someone if she had left of her own accord. But that never happened. On May 8, 1996, the investigators finally received a significant lead. Several people collecting mushrooms near Hudson Lake Road and Pitcha Road stumbled upon some clothing. At first, they didn't pay much attention to it, but then they found some jewelry. The items included a Red Hot Chili Peppers t-shirt, underwear, jeans, and a necklace with a yin-yang symbol on a leather cord. The articles of clothing were basically rags, only recognizable upon closer inspection. The fact that everything was piled up under a tree seemed suspicious, so they contacted the nearest police post. After examining the clothing, Investigator Day compared the details to Kathy's known information. The girl had been wearing similar clothing when she disappeared. Although the police had found the clothes, they did not find the girl. Investigator Day had mixed feelings at this point. On one hand, it confirmed his suspicion that she was dead. Otherwise, her clothes would not have been found in the woods. Yet it was the one piece of evidence missing to reopen a full investigation. A search team was immediately dispatched to the place where the clothing had been discovered. The officers genuinely believed they would find the body there or close by, especially when they began to dig. But that turned out to be wrong. A few days later, about 10 km west of that spot, another mushroom hunter found something that confirmed their worst fears. From a distance, he thought it was a very large mushroom, but it turned out to be part of a skull covered with leaves. He turned it slightly and discovered more bones, then more parts of a skeleton. The investigators gathered the bone fragments and an intact skull, sending everything to the forensic pathologist. Kathy Horn was found 6 months after her disappearance, and she was identified using dental records. Sadly, the pathologist could not determine a precise cause of death. He could only say the death had happened a long time ago and was likely a homicide. The fact that her clothes were found separately from her body allowed experts to conclude she had been murdered. People don't die 10 km away from their own clothing. Once the remains were identified, the police had to deliver the terrible news to Kathy's mother. She was shocked, yet in a way relieved that her daughter's remains had been found and she could finally bury her. The residents of Traverse City were horrified by the news that Kathy Horn's remains had been discovered in the woods. It was a shock to all of northern Michigan. The remains were found, but the killer was still at large. Despite this accidental discovery and the subsequent questioning, Kathy's murderer was not found for another 3 years. By then, investigators had ruled out all the wrong leads and suspicious individuals, but there were no new clues, and the investigation progressed very slowly. In 1999, the case was reopened when a story about Kathy's murder reappeared in the local newspaper. After reading the article, one man decided to come forward with what he knew. In August 1999, 5 years after Kathy Horn's remains were discovered, a man from the area contacted the police. Having seen the newspaper article about Kathy's death, He remembered her because the article included a photo and details about the events, urging anyone with information to step forward. Paul Ott claimed that in 1994, just a few days after Kathy disappeared, he saw something strange. At that time, he and his wife were enjoying the fall scenery and looking at foliage on Burke School Road when he spotted a green van with the back doors open. Normally, there's nothing unusual about a parked van on the road during that season, as people often go into the woods to pick mushrooms or look at the leaves. But in the open door of the van, he saw a girl leaning against the wall. Not far from the road stood a man holding a shovel. According to Paul, the girl looked pale, almost gray, and that image stuck in his mind. He said the man was digging a hole about 5 meters off the road. Paul didn't know the man but thought the girl could have been Kathy Horn. Paul and his wife tried to call the police from their cell phone but had no reception. Then they drove home, tried to figure out what to do, but ultimately decided against going back. Years later, when they saw the newspaper article, they realized it was the girl they had seen in the van. When Paul finally decided to testify, Investigator Day was skeptical at first. So much time had passed, but he was still relieved to have a witness who had seen an old green van and a girl who might have been Kathy on Pitch Road, the same area where her clothes were found. Paul also described the man. He said he was somewhat short and unkempt. The van was green and very old. The police concluded it was unlikely that such another wreck of a van existed in the entire region. They were convinced it had to be David Chinky's van. But why would David kill Kathy? The investigators found David quickly. He was in prison, serving a 5-year sentence for another offense involving stolen goods. Investigator Day went to the state prison. The officers confronted David with the evidence of his guilt, hoping he would confess. During their conversation, David was visibly scared and nervous but stuck to his version. He had last seen Kathy when she got out of his car. Observing the man's reaction, Investigator Day became certain he was on the right track. He knew David had something to do with the case and that there was more work to be done. To solve the crime, the investigators needed more evidence. They began by combing through old police reports and came across interesting interviews. During the initial investigation in Gaylord, the police had visited a cafe and spoken with an employee who remembered that David would sometimes take trash from the cafe and other establishments in his van to dump illegally in the vicinity where Kathy's clothes were found. But what really caught the investigators' attention was the statement of another employee who recalled seeing Kathy and her friends and that they had left with David. He said David returned about 2 hours later, sat down at a table and drank half a cup of coffee. He acted very quiet, which was not typical for him. The cafe worker also noticed David took a napkin, wrapped it around his fingers, and that he was bleeding. The cuts on the backs of David's fingers matched the suspicious wounds Investigator Day had seen the first time they met. The evidence was piling up, though the investigators still lacked a motive. Then they looked at an interview with David's neighbor, Margaret Drake. Even before Kathy disappeared, David had told her about meeting a 16-year-old girl from Traverse City, explicitly saying he wanted a sexual relationship with her. Margaret also said David did something very strange just a few days after Kathy disappeared. He completely emptied his van and asked her to wash all his clothing. It was the first time he had done so in the 2 months he'd been living there. Based on Paul's testimony, the officers were confident they had enough circumstantial evidence and arrested David for Kathy's murder. Since he never confessed, David Chinky stood trial on November 26, 2001. The prosecution based its case almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. With such cases, one can only piece together the totality of the evidence to try to reconstruct what really happened. The jury was ultimately able to form a picture, even if the evidence was limited. On November 29, 2001, After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found David Chinky guilty of murder. He was sentenced to between 35 and 52 years in prison. David Chinky has never spoken about what exactly happened between the time Kathy got into his car and the moment Paul allegedly saw her in the same van. Where did he take her? How did things unfold? How did he keep her captive? This is a secret shrouded in darkness. For the investigators who spent 7 years working on the case, the verdict brought some relief. David Chinky will never kill again. He has been caught. The people of Traverse City may never know exactly what happened, but they do know that this young, free-spirited girl died far too soon, and her mother never recovered from the loss. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.